of obvious. Yep, and by the way, this is your consent to be recorded. Hello, everybody listening later. But by putting them in the talking queue, if it's an obvious question, I'll just repeat it, and we can start a brief conversation. If it needs clarification, I'll ask you to clarify, and then we can have a conversation. Yeah, and that's about how it works. Ask me anything. My areas of passion and the areas I have the most interest in sharing stories and conversations are around portfolio management, around avoiding mechanical agility and trying to keep it inspired and full of the soul that makes Agile what it is, and around change management in a very compassionate way. Those are kind of my three areas of focus these days, if that helps inspire any questions. Great, and that's the end of my opening, so have at. Hopefully there's some seeded questions that somebody came up with.
I'll start. So one of the questions that I had when we first started talking, and knowing that you've contributed to the SAFE framework and to other parts of the SAFE organization's content, how does the framework get developed, and what how have you been involved in that process?
So personally, I've been involved. It was between SAFE 3 and 4. I forget exactly how I got involved. I believe it was at one of the SAFE leadership retreats. I was consistently complaining about how something was implemented and suggesting a different answer, and was told, well, why don't you write that down and we'll consider adding it. And that's kind of where my first two guidance articles were born for the framework, one on PI objectives and one on limiting portfolio WIP. And really the pattern that leads to participating in SAFE is having opinions, but also having ideas about how those fit, not just saying this is broken or this is wrong and stupid, but saying this is causing this kind of behavior in the enterprise. This is the impact of doing it this way. Here's an alternative. Here's the way I saw it play out when we tried that alternative. And SAFE doesn't hide in the slightest the fact that it is collecting best practices from everywhere. If something seems to be yielding results for companies, they'll see if it has a place in the framework. Some of those were okay ideas that were short-lived. You notice that in the latest versions of SAFE, technology business management has kind of been eased out and diminished. It was 8 or 10 slides in LPM prior to that. Things like capitalization don't really feel very agile, but they're on the minds of every single company out there. So collecting good ways of doing that and integrating, especially in that messy middle period when you're not yet lean funding, but you're no longer completely project funding, you got to have answers for those kinds of things. And a lot of it just follows those patterns. Here's things we see out in the world that are working. Let's see if it has a place. Early on, if you remember, there was a release management team in SAFE. Well, that wasn't very DevOpsy. So let's figure out how to bring those two communities together and integrate the DevOps story more meaningfully into SAFE. Is it a perfect fit? No, DevOps is changing and it's different in every company, so a perfect fit is kind of impossible. But at least it has some pointers on where to kind of engage, and we recognize that is a core competency. And if you can't do continuous release and you're not working towards a great pipeline and a good culture of ownership, you're not going to be successful with software. I think the Smita's question is a good follow-up. What's the most important thing that was added to SAFE 5? That's a tough one. It was a big shift. I think the sequence of evolution around recognizing organizational agility and the really pulling in everything that's outside of technology is probably the most long-term meaningful shift. I think there were other things that were good short-term fixes to stuff in the framework, but opening the door and saying this isn't about technology in a much more explicit way than it was in previous versions of the framework has done wonders for getting beyond there's a customer icon and a business owner icon to, no, this is a leadership team that is representing this customer and it needs to go across all the boundaries. And the simultaneous introduction of align around value as a principle, again, it was in the framework before. Of course, we wanted you to have end-to-end value streams captured in your release trains, but some people missed that. It wasn't blatant enough, so it was added despite Dean for years saying there will never be more than 9 principles. And he crammed like the 3 physics of work principles together into number 5, I think.
Is that why?
Yes. He didn't want the 12 principles, so limit, width, manage queues, and the other one got lumped together. So yeah, I'd say it's taking it broadly is the biggest hope that I see from it. Because if you don't have your businesses engaged, you're not ready to transform yet. Let's see, scrolling. Thanks for the appreciation, Richard, on scaffolding. It's been one of my terms. It's build a facade and then build the building behind it. And then at some point you may no longer need the scaffolding, or it may have become integrated into your building. I don't care at that point. You're probably doing a lot better than you used to be. Sherry, what do I tell clients if they want to do SAFe, but only start out with Scrum Masters and bring in RTE later? That's a whole pile of interesting questions hiding behind that one, I think. The real question isn't so much about the roles in my mind, is when they do that, I'm wondering, do they have leadership that is committed to that thing we're calling a release train? Because if they're not going to bring in a facilitative leader who's willing to steer the culture and help orchestrate and connect things, are they going to invest in an actual product manager, or are they just going to have somebody routing projects in? And are they going to really have an architect involved to complete that leadership triad? Or is it just going to be a fractional alignment out of an architecture team somewhere? And I'm not one that says thou shalt do the framework, whether it's Scrum or SAFe or anything else. I'm very much a pragmatist in most things. But when I see those questions, it really drives me to ask, are people in? Is there a commitment and a willingness to make this change or not? And that lack of willingness shows up in all these little edge questions like, well, what if we can't? What if we can't? What if we can't? We're not going to do this. And just like we've talked about Scrumbot for years, you've got the same thing in SAFe of, I want to say I'm doing this, but I don't want to change anything because changes are hard and we have to get new cost centers and I have to add a new HR job family and. So we're just going to keep working the way we are and call it SAFe. And Agile in name only isn't change. It doesn't yield any results. So that's one path I start to go down when I hear those questions. The other one is maybe they just want to get moving and they can't hire somebody quickly enough. And then my answer is, well, find a good facilitative consultant or contractor to fill that role and help you hire a good one. Because I don't want to wait 6 months if hiring cycles take that long. I might go help HR with and do a lean transformation or agile effort with the HR group. But sometimes it's hard to get good talent in a lot of these roles these days. So if it's just a question around getting started and then bringing in the RT as soon as you can get somebody, or maybe you're going to identify among the Scrum Master group who the best RT is going to be and let that role emerge, I'm more okay with that. Just somebody's got to do the work that's associated with it, or it's not really going to work.
I have a follow-up question just related to that. I'm not sure if Sherry was wanting to ask it in terms of this, but a lot of organizations are very hesitant in going in the SAFe direction because it's so huge, it's so vast. The framework needs this setup and all that. A lot of them, some of us coaches will, coach the organization to go lightweight and start with just Scrum or Kanban first, on the team level, form your teams, do your pilot, all that stuff. So my question would be like, what would would that be a good approach? Because I appreciate if something is started small scale, pilot, and we learn from small mistakes, and then, we can expand. So what do you think about that? It's kind of related to what Sherry was saying, I feel, but I'm not sure of the perspective that she had with her question, if it was.
You're not choosing to do SAFe at that point, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's not wrong or right that you're choosing to do SAFe or not. It's not. I mean, there's no values judgment attached to a lot of these things, and we like to add them in, but they're just not there. If you are going to do SAFe, and this kind of bridges into Richard's question as well, around what are the most common failure patterns. I think the biggest one is seeing companies that try to design this in its entirety for their company and overwhelm themselves and try to boil the ocean and don't take the time to experiment. And people, one of the questions I got early when I kind of stopped hanging out with the Kanban crowd as much and started investing more into SAFe is, well, what happened to small experiments, Eric? Why aren't you running small experiments? And my response is, if you have 10,000 developers, 100 people is a small experiment. And let's get 10 teams together and see what happens. Find a lightweight way to get teams collaborating in ways they haven't. Put the minimum necessary scaffolding or containers or practices or whatever you want to call them around the teams. Give them a common backlog and somebody that has responsibility over that backlog, call it a product manager, and get started. And by the way, I kind of just described less, not SAFe. It's teams of teams working together. Trying to go straight to this for a 10,000 developer organization, yeah, I can kind of guess around where it's going to land. But until I see where the real constraints are and where the impediments are in the organization, I have no idea. There's a whole section in the book I'm writing around premature scaling and the explosions it leads to. I'm not in the descaling crowd, but scaling and like throwing process at something for the sake of scaling that process, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
The other pieces around common mistakes, every time I've worked with a company trying to diagnose failed SAFe or whatever you want to call those rescue efforts, it's because they didn't do one of the 10 essential elements. For a while, Dean resisted saying what you could take out and it's still being safe. Until we realized that the real problem is we didn't know where to start diagnosing. When something wasn't working, what are the things you're going to look for first? And the vast majority of those are captured in those 10 essentials at the bottom of the Essential SAFe article. And it's like, you don't have time to innovate? Well, you're not going to have an innovative culture. You don't have well-formed teams? Well, you're not really doing Scrum or SAFe. And they're kind of the basics, but you'd be stunned how many companies say they're doing SAFe and haven't done those basics. The one squishy one is around lean agile leadership, because it's hard to check a box that your leaders are now agile. But in that one, I just look for the effort. Are people trying to behave differently? Because new behaviors is what leads to a new culture. Chris, advice on getting leaders to realize that they also need to be lifelong learners or to take the time for training. That's an interesting one, because the question itself, and I'll do this to a lot of these questions, so be ready. I'm not picking on Chris here. The question itself carries a lot of stories and or biases about what those leaders are actually thinking. And many of the leaders I work with, I spend a lot of time coaching executives. That's most of the work I do day to day these days. And most of it is truly busyness, from pressures from the board, pressures from their peers, staff, acquisition conversations. There's so many moving things that if you're in an organization, you don't actually see, that are taking real capacity and frankly, all of the decisions those leaders can bring to bear. The leaders that are good at not making decisions are the ones that tend to be the best at becoming lifelong learners. So I really don't start in that conversation. That's me telling them they're not good learners. By even
they have to reach the realization on their own is what and I agree with it. And see, to me, that's a big excuse in terms of that it's like anything that's meaningful to you, you will find time for it. If anything important to you, you will find time for it. I mean, you will carve that out on your calendar first, and then everything else will work around it, kind of thing.
I wish I could say that's the case. And I used to say those exact same things about leaders until I had a senior director role of my own.
Okay. And then it just isn't the time, I guess you're saying.
Not that there isn't the time, it's that the cost of saying no, the number of times you would have to say no to do so, starts to become its own emotional burden. Okay. And I remember that an event, also time for a story. I love stories. I was at an Agile coaches camp, one of those in Bletchley Park in England. I just happened to be over there and found out this was happening and got a ticket, or got an invite, I guess is more accurate because it was free. And I was sitting there in a workshop surrounded by some of the best known coaches from across Europe, all kind of household names in the Agile community. And we were talking about characteristics of a good CTO or of a CTO. It wasn't even a good one. And I'm engaged. We're all writing words and doing all this great Agile brainstorming. We had piles of stickies all over. And I got distracted and I checked my email and I came back, and that moment of separation gave me the perspective to look at the board and see what had happened. And I realized that every single characteristic we put up there was negative. Because we were people that were inside the organizations looking up at these leaders using traditional hierarchy language, we stereotyped all the bad things. Nothing about caring for their people, wanting to preserve jobs, trying to keep people from getting fired, trying to manage the impact of the cost reductions that were mandated by the board to try to find ways not to lay people off while doing so. And all of these pressures that are invisible and these leaders hold for the inside because they don't want to leak those across the organizations. The good ones don't. That's what pushes the learning out. I've heard stories. I heard a story very recently about somebody who was disengaged in a session. Senior leader was setting a horrible example. They'd shown up for training, but they were on mute and they were on the phone. And the facilitator or trainer had asked that person what's going on. And what that person was doing was trying to save people in that class from being fired. That's why they were distracted. So it gave me a real empathy for what leaders are really facing at the top ranks of modern, at least US organizations. That's when we say things like change has to start at the top. That's kind of why, is if you can't cascade that behavior of a different leadership style, it's really hard to behave differently when your boss is demanding the old things from you. And the higher up the hierarchy you are, the more the salary, the more the benefits, the more your family is going to suffer if you screw it up, and the more people you are responsible for. I was coaching an executive CTO who had 9,000 people rolling through him. And he knew many of them personally. He did his best to stay connected to his entire organization. But for him to take 2 days out was unheard of. And like the fact that he brought his entire leadership team for 2 days with all of his SVPs was like an honor. It was like such an exception case. So have empathy is really my guidance on this one, but also make it easy. What can you do to feed learning or serve it on a platter in a way that it's relevant, connected, and timely to those leaders, and help them create ever more space and support them instead of maybe internally, even if it never makes it out of your mouth, criticizing them for not being learners. And like I said, I'm gonna grab biases that I hear, and it's not picking on Chris in this case at all. Everybody's fair game.
No, I don't take it personally. You're fine. But that just makes me sad that it just makes me sad that that's the situation. I guess that's,
Yeah, there was a point where I became very sad and almost defeatist around the ability to help managers change, until I went and started studying new tactics and figuring out new ways to engage and finding ways to go beyond empathy towards truly having compassionate support for these leaders. Because I was stunned how hard it was once you get up into the upper ranks. Tony, where is Tony? I can't see you, Tony. I love people on video. I've got about 50-50, but I love video if you're willing. Non-leadership member, waterfall-ish, very agile adverse, pushing for more agile Scrum safe style environment. What does the team struggle with? What do the people around you care about right now?
It's a small team at a small company, and it's a bunch of people who have been doing things the same way for a very long time. They have seen every one of them has an example of a company they've seen that tried to go agile, tried to introduce Scrum, and it was just a disaster. And they all kind of take that as confirmation that is the right, that trying to change is the wrong choice. The problem is we are now falling way behind as a company where we need to be with our technology. It's an insurance company that struggles to let users access insurance online, their information, things like that. Those are the challenges we're facing. So just trying to get over that aversion. You mentioned you had tactics for conversations with management, things like that. How would you approach that?
Number one piece of advice, I won't even give you an it depends in this case, which maybe I'm not a consultant anymore, but number one piece of advice is this: is lead with a purpose. And the purpose shouldn't be more agile. What's going on in the company that if resolved, if fixed, if made better, people would love it. And focus on that and make that the conversation, and make this thing that bothers everybody, and maybe they've given up on fixing it. But make eroding that problem and making it into a little bit of a bright spot the focus, and use lean agile principles and mindsets to do so. But don't make it about agile. The most engagements that I start in, the beginning of it, the first 10, 15% feels like it's getting people to stop telling us we're going to make this agile and start saying, what's the problems you're trying to solve in the company? What's the real purpose? What strategy are you advancing? And so on. That's where the power is, because that's what people care about. You might care about agile, but clearly this team doesn't. And until they care, they're not going to support the changes.
That makes sense.
I worry whenever I see imposed agile, which is one of the biggest critiques I have personally on how SAFe characterizes the roadmap right now. The snake it comes across as being, we're doing this to you, instead of we're bringing you along on this journey. And trying to help with that transition and that opt-in mindset is one of the biggest things I'm pushing for. And there's a great guidance article. I can picture his face. I used to be in Israel, moved to Boston a few years ago.
Israel got no.
But anyway, there's a great guidance article on invitation-based SAFe and the advanced topics. So that's the first step.
Thank you.
It does mention somewhere in SAFe where it mentions how you want people to participate and you want to pull. It's the pull instead of pushing them going through the transformation. So can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were talking about the roadmap. Can you talk a little bit more about why do you feel it feels like it's we're doing this to you rather than we want you to be part of it?
Just the first SAFe did something really interesting from an agile perspective. And I don't know how much this was accidental and how much was on purpose, but it worked with the hierarchy rather than fighting the hierarchy. And
the argument about being more bureaucratic and all that. Okay.
Yep, and it has levels, and those levels, it's no accident that the program level tends to align to a director layer, and the solution kind of tends to align to a VP layer, and so on. That makes it palatable, and therefore something people can engage in. It decreases the bar you have to jump over, the ladder you have to climb in order to even get started. Along with that comes the risk, and in some cases the likelihood, that the previous management techniques will be used to apply the new world. And that's it's the cultural version of trying to deploy agility using a project plan. It's just you can't use the old to create the new, at least not very effectively. So absent leaders who are thinking in a more elevated way, in a different manner, they're more likely going to just say, okay, we want to SAFe this. Let's put SAFe on this. You 100 people show up on this date. We're going to SAFe you. And I've seen the equivalent happen, and it didn't feel very good. So it's trying to find ways to help people at least connect to the purpose. Trying to get consensus across 100 people is painful and perhaps a fool's errand, but at least getting a majority of people to care enough to try is kind of where I want it to be.
Thank you.
Like that.
I want to go into Sherry's more technical point around SAFe, because this is a fun one that I'm still playing with. The 2020 Scrum Guide and how the product goal translates or transfers into SAFe. And I think it might have been, was it this meetup group a month or two ago that Dave West was in?
That was the main meetup.
Or that was the main meetup a couple months ago. So that came up. I'm sorry?
That's the one that Catherine and I host. Yeah.
Yeah. So that came up in that one as well. And that was Dave's show, so I wasn't going to jump in and make it a big conversation. But it's a hard answer, because my understanding is in the Scrum Guide, it's a purpose that transcends multiple iterations, but is limited to a single product or the scope of a single team or team of teams. So if I use that definition, it's very close to the product release train vision. And if your release train is aligned around value, you can call what it supports a solution or a product or whatever. So the goal for that solution or product and the product goal from Scrum seem to be pretty well aligned. Alternately, and equally viable, in the Agile Product Management course, Luke Holman introduced the concept of a product brief, which is a series of features that experimentally roll up to a larger aspiration or goal for the product. And you might have multiple of those going on at the same time. Like, we want to increase the product's attractiveness to users in the 12 to 24 or 12 to 18 age cohort. We want to improve our penetration of South America, and we want to decrease our COGS by migrating to a different platform. You might have 3 or 4 different briefs going on of different natures, but each one then allows for a series of more experimental features rather than a queue or project plan worth of features. So I'm not sure which one is the best fit, but it's somewhere in that space in my mind.
I haven't ever heard of product brief before.
It's not in the framework proper yet. It might be alluded to or mentioned briefly in the product management competency article. SAFe has actually turned things inside out intentionally during SAFe 5, where they'll introduce new concepts in the courseware. And then if they resonate and stick, they'll bubble them up to the framework proper. But having people trying to directly implement what's in the framework, which may be slightly experimental, doesn't bode well when you have 100 companies out there all trying to do it at once without understanding the purpose behind it. So by putting it in through the courseware, you generally get introduced to it by an instructor who hopefully understands it and is able to give you a little bit of the background and mindset of it. So I don't have a perfect answer, but that's my thoughts on it. Sally, as we've worked remotely, what dramatic changes have you seen and what has stayed the same? I'm going to actually say that all of you are probably better suited to answer that than I am. As a consultant who tends to drop in and out of organizations and see people for training courses, the biggest change for me has been people are 2-dimensional instead of 3. And it was warmer because instead of flying everywhere, I spent the winter living in Baja because everything was remote. But yeah, I think everybody here has personal experiences that directly say what's easier and what's harder and what's changed. So I don't know if I want to take a shot at answering that one. Veronica's whispering side voice to me. So I will say that there's I have seen companies do 2,000 plus person PI plannings for an entire portfolio on the same date remotely. That never happened before. So there's things like that, but I don't know.
Well, I can see, I know we've taken a lot more time. We're taking almost a full week now with PI planning. And I feel like that's kind of an anti-pattern. Well, it definitely is an anti-pattern. But I don't see it changing. It just things, I can see it taking a little longer, but I think we've almost gone too far to where I'd love it. And so, and then this may not last. So we may, I don't know if, I'm curious to see how much in-person PI planning we can get back to and how that, is going to work.
I want
And
to grab on
training
that.
too.
Well, I want to grab on that one, Chris, because that's actually I don't know that it's an anti-pattern now. That's one I've changed my mindset on and I'm exploring a little bit. One of my European clients is experimenting with a model where they actually introduce the top 10 features and kind of what's going on a week early, and teams kind of do more amorphous planning across teams through Slack, through video, and then they come together for a little bit of high density synchronous connection over like two or three days of a few hours. And it's a different model. It's a different mindset. They don't claim to be doing safe either. So I'm not criticizing anything on the model. It's just, it's worth opening up and exploring things that instead of big batch planning, stretch it out a little bit. That's in alignment with the values. It's all during the iteration, so it doesn't really break the container. I'm not convinced that's a bad thing.
Those are some of the things that I'm interested in seeing, like how all of this falls out. Like I think some people have just kind of held on for a year and done things the same way and tried to, they use maybe their whiteboards and some of the tools that are available, but how are some of these things actually going to be improvements? You have it like you're describing a combination of asynchronous and synchronous PI planning, where you still get the richness of the collaboration, but you can find some efficiencies elsewhere. So I think it's interesting to see how different companies have done that.
Yeah, training is a great example. I mean, the Safe Training Catalog was created to be delivered by mostly traveling consultants.
Right.
So compressing it into the fewest numbers of days on the road was a necessity in order to generate enough interest around the world to do it in the early days of Safe. Now, I love teaching courses. I add a day at least to every single course and shrink the day. Mm-hmm. I don't want to go 9 to 5 as an instructor. I don't want my students to listen to 9 to 5. Zoom gets old fast. Mm-hmm. Remote training. I've heard lots of anecdotes of people with far higher satisfaction from remote training than they did from face-to-face. Mm-hmm. Just because it's less draining. I don't know.
Designing a program instead of a class.
Yeah, so changing the models, stretching things out so they're longer term programs. My muse is continuing to whisper at me. But there's just lots of things that are shifting around this that I want to question possibilities instead of presuming constraints. And think we have a lot of constraints we build up where we assumed it had to be a way just out of habit. And as Agilists, I think it's on us to notice those things and bring them into retrospectives, whether it's at a team level, a program level, or the entirety of SAFE level, as the case may be. Richard continues to not ask questions, but I like the statements he's making. I'm just working my way down the chat log, so lots of commentary. Where is culture represented in SAFE? If you zoom in the bottom left-hand corner, there's about 12 pixels. Realistically, culture is everywhere. And I have a very simple definition of culture. Culture is the sum of all behaviors. When people start to act differently, you have changed your culture. When the norm and the expected behavior is different than it used to be, and the people that are seen as not fitting in the culture are the ones doing the old behaviors rather than the new behaviors, then your culture has changed. That's when the sustainable change starts to kick in. So when I look at where culture is, it's the people. It's embedded in the principles. It's part of the values. I mean, all of that is culture, and it's how people act. I also don't try to change culture. I don't go in thinking culture is a thing I work on. It's something I get people to behave differently, and eventually a new culture emerges. Now, I have very strong opinions about what that culture should be and what kinds of behaviors they should have that lead to that culture and so on. But I get very worried when I hear leaders start to talk about culture changing initiatives and things like that. And you're completely right. The word culture doesn't show up much. It hides in the House of Lean, and it's in the name of one of the competencies around learning. Yes, you do a lot of SAFE training, and most of the classes seem to have way more material than you can cover successfully. Absolutely, constantly, I get that feedback. And like I said, even when I was teaching face-to-face, I taught leading SAFE in 3 days. Just to create space for the leaders in the room to have the deeper conversations and start to think about behavior change and org change, and not just get buried under the knowledge and hope they did something with it. So yes, it's still true. If you look though, if you take the last like 5 versions of leading SAFE and hold them up, slide count slowly decreasing, and the density of the content is slowly decompressing. But it's a very slow change, so you might not notice it all. And it's true of almost all the classes, and the saving grace of that in my mind is that in most, if not all of the classes, you can think you're way behind, then you realize the last 3 lessons are actually far shorter than you thought they were. So you can usually make it up, but it still feels like way too much every time, no matter how many hundreds of classes I've taught.
And this is Chris. I asked the question. I know SAFE recommends that, you're teaching remotely, you teach it over, I think, 3 days, most of the classes. We work, like most people, with a lot of major corporations, and they just won't do more than 2 days. So we end up doing 2 full days and, barely getting everything in and feeling like we are, shortcutting some things. And, so I just really hope that the material starts to change to make it, more beneficial for the students, and they don't feel so rushed.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add or share on that. I do say that's an opportunity to look at the leadership and dig into why that 2 days feels like it's a constraint or a container, and what's leading to that. And maybe you can start to ease the constraints somewhere else in the system to create a little more opportunity to learn instead of just absorb knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I was hugely appreciative. One of the LACE leaders, or back then it was, this was before the term LACE, so I think it was the Center of Excellence or EE team, or I forget the name of it, but it was a major insurance company, and the woman who led that just said, this is a 3-day class. She didn't tell people it was meant to be a 2-day class. Now, in that company, it was a 3-day class, so it didn't matter what SAFE said.
Yeah, we're doing the best we can, but it's definitely a struggle. And of course, the students are usually worried about what's going to be on the test as well, so we're just trying to do best we can on that.
Cool. Yeah, keep focusing on learning and minimizing, this is a weird one. Well, actually, it's not weird. Minimize the intent of the certification and maximize the intent of change in the behavior and in the learning of the people in the classes. I often kick off classes by saying, if you pay attention and you engage, you'll probably pass the test.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to focus on making sure you understand the content and how to use it.
Right.
And most people pass the test, and some take a couple rounds and then they pass the test and what have you. Mm-hmm. But it's got to be about the change, not about the letters you get as a result.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you.
You see Richard's emerging.
That's one thing that I think the virtual classes don't handle as well, because I feel like when you have the face-to-face classes, you get better interaction. You can convince people better. At least I feel like I can, because people are shy of video a lot. I mean, it's like, so I just see that sometimes you don't get as many, you don't hook as many people as you might have in person. I will say that, even though I think people like the classes much better, sometimes I feel like the depth isn't as much virtually, and it just maybe takes a lot longer, and we'll get there. That's another possibility, that as we finally get used to video.
It takes a little longer. I think there's more investment beforehand in working agreements and setting expectations and partnering with people. And then especially with mid-level and higher leaders, and I think probably with deeper specialists and other functions like architects and so on, invest the time into the empathy interviews beforehand. Really get to know the people in the class as an instructor and what their challenges and hopes and goals and so on are. And having been connected beforehand, either whether I'm a facilitator or whether I'm a trainer, knowing some people in the class, knowing what they value in various ways, what they're struggling with, what the elephants are, and so on, lets me connect with them. And I can look somebody in the eyes through Zoom, but they hear that I'm speaking to them because I'm using their words back.
I like that a lot. Thank you. No,
and
especially the empathy interviews. I like that idea a lot.
Yep. And that will possibly transform people's engagement and training. One, they know you, they care about you a little bit because they know you, so they just show up and they're a little bit more present. And sometimes that comes from the most unexpected sources in classes too. Most unexpected people.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Yeah. Richard, something that I can share that might surprise folks that's emerging in the framework. There's one that might surprise everybody, and even though it's April Fool's Day, I'll say it. SAFE is going to ask people to care about feelings. And they're going to ask leaders to care about feelings. So that's one that is emerging, and I can talk about it. I just finished the enablement for the Lead by Example program that Dr. Steve Maynard created over the last year. So it's not publicly available yet. It will only be sold initially for some foreseeable future to SAFE enterprise customers, but because I just need to bake the program better. But it is very much about authenticity and acting with courage and being self-aware of your emotions. And it's wildly different than anything you might have seen or expected from SAFE in the past. So
it's exciting. That
like,
coincidentally ties to my culture question, right? So I'm not so concerned about where can it show up in the words or in the guidance, but where does it really show up in the core of intent?
Yeah. Ideally, it shows up in the leaders.
Yeah.
Sherry, I love your bright spots comment. Again, it's not a question, but I'll highlight it. Love celebrating good behaviors because that anchors and accelerates culture. Celebrations by leaders and demonstrations, lead by example from leaders, count extra. So keep it up.
So what will that look like talking about feelings? That was
what does it look like talking about feelings? Ooh. It probably looks like leaders on stage that seem more authentic. It shouldn't be leaders up on stage leaking all their emotions. And I mean, another piece of empathy back to the earlier conversation is senior leaders who are being asked to change their behaviors or choosing to change their behaviors are doing so in full sight of their entire organizations. They don't get to just like disappear and come back 3 months later changed. I mean, like Mark Benioff did that when he shipped his phones ahead to Hawaii and then took the slow boat and did like a 2-week retreat on his way to Hawaii. And he was like, I made these decisions while I was gone. So you can, but it's not the common case. You're going through a journey that takes at least months, if not years, of practice to discard 30 years of old behaviors and bring in a whole new set of behaviors while everybody's watching you and probably you at least feel like they're criticizing every little slip you make and seeing everything and getting up on a town hall in front of 9,000 people and trying to use a different set of words isn't comfortable. It's not easy, fluffy change. It's hard. So what does it look like? It looks like people showing up differently. It looks like people asking different questions. It looks like leaders asking questions like David Marquez's new book, Leadership as Language, and using those words as they engage instead of, you're good with this, right? And variations of that theme. It's all about modeling, to Sherry's point. I may have just reached the bottom of the backlog. Can we get some more product owners in here to fill up the backlog again? Ooh, I love that
Can
one.
I
What
throw out one
books?
question to the whole group? Just has anybody been successful in getting the word grooming completely out of the vocabulary of your business?
I don't know if I've been fully successful, but I don't use it.
I don't, but it's just, and now it's just so, but we're trying, we're working on it.
It's a great example of modeling. Just a question in the group, is anybody unfamiliar with why grooming is a bad term or a less preferred term now?
I do explain it sometimes to accelerate getting it out of the language.
I Googled it and found a
Sure.
good little chat room that really laid out the definition from the dictionary, and then so I sent that to some folks, some key folks and stuff, just to explain it. And I think that went a long way. I think once they really understood why, that helped a lot.
Yeah, so if you have that reference, if you'd share that into the chat, I'd appreciate it, Chris.
I don't think I've heard what the issue is with that. I haven't heard grooming as a 4-letter word before.
So the short version is, in the UK and in other English-speaking countries besides the US, grooming has connotations of pedophiles
Yep.
preparing children.
Yep. Okay.
I've seen it
That
more
explains
here
it.
recently.
And it's starting to show up in various ways, and I think in the US culture as well. Interestingly to that question though, for companies that have never been agile in the past, it's easy. You introduce them to refining backlogs and decomposing work. You just never use the term grooming. It's people that have been in Scrum for 2 decades that struggle the most, because it just became part of our culture as Agilists, and it's really our cultural journey to undo it. It's not on the companies, it's on the Agilists. What books have impressed me recently? Leadership as Language is a big one. I love that. Team Topologies is top of my list. It's become my new visual language for org design. Better, Value, Sooner, Safer, Happier. I got them all in the right order. Is a phenomenal book that talks about the journey of Barclays through Jonathan Smart's voice and a few other people that were along the journey for him. And it is a great example of invitation-based agility.
I got it.
Can you
Thank
say
you.
that one again?
No.
Better, Value, Sooner, Safer, Happier.
Okay.
I could pop up my Kindle and start looking as well. Good night, Moon.
That is
Perfect. I'll try to remember to add references to any more as they come up. Let's see. I'm actually looking in my queue. I've got a few that I think are going to be good. Oh yeah, Love is Free, Guac is Extra.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the story from Monty, the founder of, or longtime CEO of Chipotle. Love is free, guac is extra. There's a section there that I struggle with, and the rest of the book I loved. Yeah, if you haven't read Dare to Lead and Brene Brown's work, of course, please go read those. They're critical to being good leaders. Nicole Ferguson's Accelerate and the books around DevOps, and kind of everything IT Revolution has published kind of falls into that category. Sally, you're keeping up with all this because everybody wants you to share it now.
It'll be in the recording if we didn't capture some of them. Let's see.
Yeah, and then, so that's kind of the recent list. Going back into the older books, the other Accelerate, so not Nicole Ferguson's Accelerate, but Cotter's Accelerate, XLR8, is phenomenal. The Advantage is a phenomenal book. American Icon is the story of the Ford turnaround a decade or two ago. And it is a phenomenal example of how to allow leaders to change without changing the leaders. It is perhaps the best large-scale company example of that, of allowing leaders to take the journey instead of the typical turnaround of firing all the leaders and starting over. Unicorn Project, Phoenix Project. I mean, I can list all the Agile classics at this point, but okay, let's see next. Oh, wow. Lots of links showing up. Thank you. Fierce
Well,
leadership. Thank you. Yep.
Sorry that one link is so long, but I did find it. If it seemed to go there, so.
In the middle of all that, I asked for a favorite podcast too.
I actually, so I don't listen. I am not a good listener. I don't learn well orally in the sound sense. So I don't listen to podcasts. I don't use audiobooks. I often actually, I don't right now, but I often have a transcription engine live on my phone so I can read what people are saying so that I can make sure I understand it better. So can't answer the podcast question. Feel free to flood the chat with your favorite podcasts.
+1, but you're on.
Yes, Veronica's telling me I'm supposed to say I was just on Mick +1, so I recommend his podcast for the Project Product podcast.
Oh, nice.
Lessons learned. Sherry, narrow that question down a little bit. That's pretty general.
I just love hearing about people's lessons learned. It's a great takeaway, and it's a great way to share out to the community so that we can learn from those lessons as well. So is there anything that comes to mind that is something that you took to heart, that you actually, you learned and it stuck with you?
I think the biggest lesson is I was an engineer by training. I believe in solutions. I was trained, I was raised, I was trained. My dad was an engineer, my grandfather was an inventor. There are solutions. And for me, the branching away from that in two ways became kind of the most important turning point lessons in my career. One is in the power of purpose, giving people purpose, anchoring them in a direction, and not telling them how to get there, but just helping everybody come together and emotionally believe that that is the right place to end up, or something like it. It doesn't even have to be precise. And then the other is the power of iteration. I was a smart guy. I can design anything. I can give you the answer. I believe there's solutions. I'm an engineer. But the power of exploration and fiddling and messing with things and iterating your way to the right answer, instead of believing that it's a complicated thing that you can just solve, that's one of the biggest lessons learned for me in my career. That was luckily for me a long time ago. Although the urge is always there. The urge is always there to just say, I know the answer to this. Let me give everybody the answer so we can move on. Instead of saying, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? What would better look like? How do we understand if we're moving towards better? Does anybody have an idea on what we might do to help us reach that better? Which of these experiments can we trust to run safely in the next 2 weeks, in the next 2 months? And working your way there, and then discovering all those other ways of looking at the problem you never even thought about, not to mention the times you didn't even understand the problem in the first place. And yeah, that's probably the hardest one to keep coming back to. And then along with it, one of my favorite words is equanimity, being truly okay with where people go. One of my consulting mindsets is, it's not my job to tell you where to go. It's my job to get you off the hill you're on. You don't like where you're at for some reason. Let's help you move. But it's not my job to tell you where to move to. I can give you some advice. I can tell you there's a deep ravine over there, and there's a raging river over there, and there's a really sunny glade out there. But it's not my job to tell you. I can just help you. Barry, expand on my thoughts on journey versus destination of a transformation. I'm gonna share a brief story. And that is a company that possibly the best, most engaged leaders of change I've ever seen. They wanted the change. Their people were supportive. They knew they were in a bad place. They wanted to get to a better place. So they laid out the transformation roadmap and they executed it and they got to that new place and things were better and they stopped. They had reached the destination. They didn't continuously improve beyond that. And I'm going to go back to 2005, 2006, sitting at lunch with Mary Poppendike and hearing her talk about relentless improvement. And that was the first time I've heard it as relentless. And it stuck with me ever since then. It's like, never stop improving. There's always something that can be better. Celebrate what is good, celebrate what's already better, but don't stop. And then since then, it's just ever more taking a journey mindset and recognizing that for most companies, the journey has well understood stages. You start by exploring agility and kind of playing with it, seeing what it might do here. We have all the industry stories out there, but until we experience it ourselves, it's hard to believe. So we want to play with it. And then what a lot of companies try to do is right after that, take it big. Hey, we've explored it. This is going to work. Let's get everybody some of this. And that's what I call exploding agility. And it's not good. It ends in explosion. The systems aren't ready. The organization hasn't figured out how to operate with agility. The HR team is behind the gun. Finance hasn't integrated it. Leaders don't know how to do strategy differently yet. There's all these different things that if you suddenly go from one release train, which is a nice experiment you can safely ignore, to 20 of them, or you go from 5 Scrum teams to 500 Scrum teams, the organization will break. And that's the Agile failure. It's that you deployed it all. It's not that you didn't, well, you either stop and didn't get anywhere, or you just did too much of it without actually making the company Agile. You made a bunch of Agile teams. So instead, there's this second phase and a healthy journey of exercising agility. Take those critical things, the ones that when you start to work on this program, because it's a strategic imperative, everybody will pay attention to it and start trying to add agility in there and launch that release train. But as coaches, as a center of excellence, overstaff it. Be ready, because finance is going to show up and ask some hard questions. And then as soon as they show up, you take them out to lunch and you get to know them and understand their concerns. And then you do the same with HR and you do the same with risk management and with strategy and the safety team and support and everybody else that is actually part of the real value stream that you weren't thinking about. And once you have empathy for all of their concerns, you start helping them use agility to do their job better to support the train or whatever it is you launched. And this is where that empathy comes in. It's actually the genesis of where I started to have that I can't solve this knowledge. I'm not a financial expert. I've never been a CFO. I can talk mostly competently about capitalization, but I can't tell you how it happens in Europe and in New Zealand and Africa. There is knowledge under below the surface level. And as Agilists, I think we have this habit of showing up and knocking the door and says, hey, I'm here. I'm going to make your function Agile. You have to do Agile finance now. Let me show you what that is. Hand wave, hand wave. And they're like, yeah, I see that. We've tried that 4 times in the last 20 years, and here's all the ways it broke. And I'm stereotyping Agilists, but it's often we have very inflated opinions of our ability to fix things instead of partnering with people and helping to understand their concerns and helping them learn how to iterate and solve their own problems. So in that exercising stage, it's all about picking those problems and helping those groups learn better ways to integrate with agility and maybe even make your train stronger and better because they're really smart in their areas. And then that moment when you're no longer afraid of somebody launching a new release train without you noticing, and that does happen sometimes when you're leading a transformation, by the way, a new train will pop up and you're like, where did that come from? By the way, that experience turned one of my scorecards from red to green one year. So I was very happy with the 7 trains that popped up out of nowhere, but it was a surprise. But when you're no longer afraid of that happening, that's when you're ready to scale. Because it's like it's the same thing of the DevOps journey. When you get to that moment when you no longer care if it's going to be a release this weekend because nobody has to pay attention to it, then it's okay, and you've reached it, you've kind of hit that DevOps plateau, you're good. It's the same thing with transformation. If a new team can start practicing, if a new train can show up, if a new group can start doing or being agile, and you don't have to care, that's when you're ready to scale. And that's expanding agility is the journey stage. And then at some point, you start expecting agility and you start to actively and intentionally go find the holdouts. But for a long time, I don't actually care about the holdouts. I just ignore them. There's groups that aren't doing agile. Cool. Their leaders aren't ready. The leaders tell me to come make their group agile. I say, great. Are you ready to invest? That's a trick I learned from Ray Orell, who used to be at Intel for years. Are you ready to invest to lead your own transformation? If they say, no, go do it to my people, I say, you're not ready. When you're ready, I'll come back and help you. And I go work with another group that the leaders are invested. But at a certain point, when most of the organization is behaving one way, those holdouts are actively holding back the bottom line of the company. They're creating problems. And it's no longer about leaning into the journey. They're now just dragging their heels. And there's different ways to solve that. And it's situational. And there's the lightweight, like, hey, it's really time, stop messing around, to the, you're not the leader of this group anymore. And I've seen the whole spectrum play out in various places. And then finally, you're just expand, or I forgot what my fifth stage of the journey is. It's another E. You just, agile is what you are, and you're now looking at what's beyond agile. You're expanding beyond the what we call agile. You are the Googles, and you're trying to figure out what's next. Pick your favorite agile company. Yeah, so that was the journey. Any follow-on questions there? That's one of my favorite topics, if you can't tell. The interesting thing is that every step along that journey, the reason I picked those stages is the group leading the transformation must take a completely different stance and behave and interact with the company in a very different way. And that's why it matters to understand where you are. How do you help orgs and clients understand what metrics they want to measure? First, I help them understand what their purpose is. What is their strategy? What does success look like for the business for a year? And then we can start to understand what agility might do to move those metrics and where we want to do that. I might be an outlier here, but I have very few agile specific metrics that aren't business metrics. Now, I do care about things like cost per feature, because that's a business metric. How much does it cost me to get the next feature out the door? I care about feature throughput, because I want to know how often I'm absorbing change into my business. So a lot of the agile metrics do matter to business if you present them that way. But I don't add a lot of team or train specific metrics, really. And we can go down a whole lot of interesting side tunnels there, I suspect, if you want to ask more detailed questions. But I will say there's 4 levels of metrics I pay attention to. Purpose metrics, which are kind of the outcomes for the company, whether it's financial or if you're a nonprofit, it's tied to your mission and goals as a nonprofit, but it's kind of like, are you achieving your outcomes? There's product metrics, which are the outside-in metrics of how people perceive and interact with your product, both on the cost and the value side. So like the money you pay Amazon for hosting is a cost metric. That's part of your product metrics. Engineering metrics or factory metrics, if it was a language I used in the past, and that's where you get the feature velocity and the defects escaped and all those kinds of typical agile metrics are there. And then the lowest level of metric is activity metrics. Did you do what you said you do? And I really just, unless I'm diagnosing something, I really don't look at those. I try to keep companies from using too many of the activity metrics. Did I drain the backlog again? Oh, Richard. Complicated and complex. Cynefin is one of my favorite things to try to avoid explaining to executives. The concepts of complexity, as coaches, as people trying to scale agility, absolutely look at Dave Snowden's work and understand Cynefin and the complexity and the idea of simple versus complicated versus complex versus chaotic. And this is back to my I don't know everything. I used to say, why do you need that middle part? But that disordered where the system doesn't know its own state and it's not in a cohesive state is a really important one to understand. So go learn that. But it's one of those things that I'm very cautious before I throw it in front of a team full of leaders of any sort. There's a rat hole, and really all they need to know is some things are unknowable, some things are knowable, and try to make sure you know the difference. And if you can't know the difference, treat it as if it's not knowable so that you're not going to be surprised. I do see a lot of Agilists that treat too many things as complex when they could be complicated and actually be more efficient. And that's an interesting one. When I start to talk about efficiency and Agilists like, you can't do that. I'm like, yeah, I care. That's how we run a business. The operational side of the business really cares. Need more focused questions, or I'm going to start rambling now.
I just add to that, Eric, real quick. They struggle with unknowable, though, right? I say they, often people, humans, we struggle with unknowable, and there is this urge to solve or urge to rush to a solution rather than the openness to, quote, experiment, or the openness to, explore how things could be as an organization is evolving.
It's an interesting one to dig into. Another lens on that, another lens on that is the hesitation around the unknowable ties into instinctive fear. That which unknown might kill me. So the idea of something being unknowable, people recoil from, and they like their safe fears. And that also creates a fear of experimentation. So to your point, getting safe to fail experiments using Snowden, I think it was Snowden's original language, I forget, maybe it was before that. But really focusing on safe to fail and small experiments. Veronica and Christine talk frequently about micro habits. What's the smallest thing you can change to start building a new habit around this? Because that's not threatening. And it's really trying to help people not fear it, not be against it, but just to accept that there is a certain amount of reality here, and at the right time we should explore some of these things. And maybe we don't have to explore all of them. Maybe it's okay to ignore some of them for a while. Can I talk about more about diagnosis, interesting situations, theory, and learned it was completely different. I think, I have a few examples here, and probably more than I can share for sure. But one of the more interesting ones, and this was 6 or 7 years ago, I was relatively new on my own journey with SAFe. It was probably my first big implementation, and it was also a kind of a company crisis situation at the same time. And prior to that, I had been a very strong, very highly opinionated that you needed to build good Scrum teams, and then you could take those teams and make a release train. And I held that as almost a core Agile belief at that point in time. And I went in thinking on this 500-person program that they were spending $100+ million on that year, and it was 5% of the company scorecard for a very well-known brand. That first thing was going to be get some teams going, because we need to create teams in order to create stability to do all the other great Agile things. And as I started listening, I ended up, I'm not going to tell you all the details of what led to the realizations, because some of it's not appropriate to share, but a couple mileposts along that journey. One was after my first week visiting the company and not really knowing where I was going. It was literally the instruction was, come in and look around and see if you have any ideas on how to help. That was my engagement plan. And at the end of that, the group program manager, who had been ignoring me all week, came and had passed me off on somebody 2 levels down to just show me around, came in and said, hey, I've got an hour. What did you learn? And I said, I pulled out some diagrams and circled, like, this is going to blow up if it hasn't already. And I think you, on the current plan, you have 0 chance of delivering this initiative. And he looked me in the eye tilted his head a little bit and said, "You are the first consultant who has actually said that. We all know it, but none of us want to admit it." And that naming of the elephant created in an instant trust. It's like, if he's willing to say this, he's willing to say whatever else he needs to say. So we got further into it. And what I learned over that journey is that we did not launch a single Scrum team. We gave like a 1-hour overview on what user stories were and kind of the idea of how to break down work into smaller pieces. And our instruction on identifying teams was take any group of 5 or more people that's working together and call them a team. And that was it. And they put a post-it note for every one of those groups, and we had 47 post-it notes, and we started putting them together on the board based on who needed to work together more. And out of that emerged probably one of the cleanest value stream train identifications I've ever worked with. It was business aligned, it was purpose aligned, it had high dependency density inside the train and minimal dependency density outside the trains. But I didn't go through all the Scrum literature. I didn't talk about teams. We didn't go form these teams and come back. As soon as we had laid that out and identified the most important work for each of those trains, and by trains I mean flip charts with 10 boxes on them with post-its for clumps of humans, value started flowing. Yes, we ended up doing PI planning. The first one was all the leads. Exactly what SAFe tells you not to do. Why was it all the leads? Because we did it 4 days after we did it. Let's see. So Monday and Tuesday, we taught leading SAFe to the group of leaders. Wednesday and Thursday, this is the first week of the new year, by the way, we did that exercise, and we had all their epics for the year-long program in 4 tranches along the wall. We had these sheets, and by the time they got done outlining the work, they were desperate to start laying out the shape of these release trains. We had those on the wall, and they decided that they couldn't afford to wait because they only had, they had a deadline that would have been in the newspapers if they missed. The next Monday, we did PI planning. So there was no time to get the 400 developers and various sorts from 28 different vendors in the room. They just said, let's do it. And honestly, these days, we'd probably call it solution pre-planning. It would have been a very good solution planning workshop under today's lingo. But suddenly value flowed. As soon as each of those groups had a purpose and something they could own, it started working. They got rid of the 17 disparate work streams that were aligned to different systems. And they had 4 release trains very large release trains, but 4 release trains that could own things and move them forward. And 13 weeks later, they were able to do an end-to-end demo in what the company referred to as the high school musical for the next year, because it was in the auditorium, and the leaders of the program dressed up as the personas for the system and demoed the system. And that company had never deployed in less than 6 months before. So my realization, my diagnosis and learning out of that is, for all of our care and value of good Agile teams, the developers aren't the problem. It's rarely that the teams are actually the problem in my experience now. And now that I've learned to not jump to that conclusion, I spend very little of my time worrying about what the teams are screwing up. And most of my time in making sure the teams are in an environment where they can be successful. And the teams generally figure out their own stuff based on that. That doesn't mean you don't need good Scrum Masters and all that. You still need great people helping teams get better. But actually, another learning point or a compelling point I give leaders often is, if you look at all the stuff you have to do to decide what software to build and get the funding for it and sequence it and allocate people and manage the release and put it out there and deploy it into your business and train people how to use it and get it delivering value. If I took all of that and I made development, the coding piece, 0 days and $0, you got up to where you're ready to code, it was suddenly free, and the next moment you could start your release process. But everything else was full cost. How much would that cost? And usually in most modern enterprises, when I look at that, the cost of the software is trivial in terms of time compared to everything else. Dollar cost is still fairly high, but the time cost is maybe 10% sometimes. Everything else loads the majority of the system. So that was another turning point learning that I've started looking for in every company now. And I think we're at time, right?
Yep, we are at time. So unless anyone has a final question, I think this is a good natural place to stop. So Eric, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation and such amazing information. Lots of good notes in the chat and all of that. So, and thanks for everyone who came and gave us good questions and participated.